Hello everybody, my name is Owen Bennett. I'm the Assistant Director of the Montgomery County Historical Society at Lane Place. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today at the Lane Place. Whether you're in person or watching online, to see another installment of the Montgomery County Historical Society's Lessons in History lecture series. In this series, we explore how items from our collections connect to broader themes in United States history. Our previous lecture focused on artifacts related to the American Civil War and examined how the conflict served as a catalyst for modernity in various aspects of American life, which include politics, society, technology, and the economy. If you weren't able to attend this lecture in person, that's okay, it's no problem at all. You can actually visit the Montgomery County Historical Society's YouTube channel to view the last month's lecture. It's really our goal to upload each month's lecture onto YouTube, just to kind of increase, viewership and just knowledge on a digital platform of kind of the interesting things that the Historical Society has in our collection and just how the items itself do connect to the broader aspects of American history. So stay in tune and keep an eye out for those videos when you see them. However, today I present you with a complex story about the dual nature of a historically significant publication. And you can see a few different prints here that I have really from this publication. And the publication of focus today is The History of the Indian Tribes of North America by Thomas Lorraine McKenney and James Hall. And so this work both serves as a visual and written record of Native American leaders from various nations, many of whom would actually be displaced, marginalized, or forgotten in the dominant American memory during the mid-19th century. McKenney and Hall's History of the Indian Tribes of North America captures the memory of westward expansion, a period where growth of the American Empire came at the expense of indigenous life and culture. At the same time, the work reflects how a few Americans sought to preserve the identities of various indigenous leaders and nations on the brink of erasure, despite following the selective bias determined by the United States government during the signing of land cession treaties and agreements. So with this little bit of context in mind, today's lesson will actually really begin during the American Revolutionary War era and proceed throughout the Federalist era underneath President George Washington's leadership before following Thomas L. McKenney and his service in the War of 1812 and in the Jacksonian era politics that followed. So first I'd like to talk just a little bit about what I would like to call a time of radical change, just kind of providing you with an overview of federal Indian policy during the Federalist through Jacksonian eras. So for this, I'll actually begin in 1781. So in 1781, the United States Congress passed the Indian Commerce Clause under Article 9 of the Articles of Confederation, which granted Congress the, quote, sole and exclusive right and power of regulating the trade and managing all affairs with the Indians, end quote. Although commerce with Native Americans was restricted to Congress, at least according to the Articles of Confederation, well, it was a little bit contradictory, as the articles also went on to say that the, quote, the legislative right of any state within its own limits be not infringed or violated, end quote. The contradictory restrictions caused further tension between the states and the federal government, who both, quote, vied for authority in negotiations with the Creeks, Cherokee, Six Nations of the Iroquois, and other Native nations, end quote. The contradiction persisted as the United States replaced the Articles of Confederation with the United States Constitution in the years leading up to its adoption. Beginning in June 1787, the Constitutional Convention held several meetings in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, actually over a course of 4 months, to establish an improved governing document that addressed the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation. During an August Constitutional Convention meeting, James Madison proposed granting Congress the power to, quote, regulate affairs with the Indians as well as within as without the limits of the United States, end quote. And this really served as a way to overturn the limitations of Article 9, that confusion that we saw there between state and federal authority over conducting commerce with the Native Americans. So after further discussion, the Committee of Postponed Parts, or really you can think of it as a committee of lingering questions, finalized the language in the final constitutional draft to grant Congress the, quote, power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So really at this point you can think of the federal government kind of associating Native Americans as like a foreign nation. Like it gives the federal government that authority to have communications and conduct commerce with these tribes. So it's kind of interesting how you can see them kind of looping in Native Americans with foreign governments at this point. However, although the delegates claimed that federal authority in the newly drafted United States Constitution, the relative neglect of the Indian Commerce Clause continued throughout the 1790s as anti-federalists, including New York Senator Abram Yates Jr., argued that the clause, quote, granted the federal government an improper supremacy over Indian affairs, end quote. So at this point you can see where anti-federalists like Abram Yates Jr., they started seeing like an increase of federal authority, which kind of made them uneasy at the time. So keep that in mind as we go out through this lecture, the rise of federal authority over particularly Native American affairs. In 1789, American citizens elected General George Washington as the first president of the United States of America, marking the beginning of the Federalist era, which really went from 1789 until about 1801. And really you can think of the Federalist era as a time that was characterized by the establishment of the United States government and advocacy for a strong central government. Again, think central government, kind of the rise of federal power. It's really central power for the time, as opposed to kind of a decentralized government where each state has their own individual power. So it's more of a collective authority. And so in an attempt to centralize this federal authority, or this centralized authority over indigenous land, Congress passed the Non-Intercourse Act of 1790, which confirmed the federal government's exclusive authority over trade and relations with Native American tribes and prohibited any unlicensed individuals from engaging in any trade or intercourse with the Indian tribes without the federal approval. Over the next 6 years, Congress passed 2 additional non-intercourse acts, one in 1793 and the other in 1796, which gradually expanded federal authority over indigenous lands. Although the United States Congress passed several non-intercourse acts until around about 1834, I'd like to specifically focus on those passed in 1793 and 1796 as they directly relate to our main character in this story, that being Thomas Lorraine McKenney. The Non-Intercourse Acts of 1793 and 1796, both approved by President Washington, established a federal position to serve as a liaison between the United States government and the Native American tribes to coordinate trade, distribute government goods, and oversee land transactions, control economic activity, and to, quote, promote civilization among the friendly Indian tribes, end quote. Really as a way to suppress indigenous culture and religious practices. So really it's like this raising of federal authority to impose their beliefs in a way on these indigenous tribes living in territory of the United States at this point, or territories of the United States at this point. In 1806, the United States War Department established the Office of Indian Trade, where the Bureau superintendents managed the United States fur trade factory system as a way to regulate trade and manage diplomatic relations with Native Americans. And really to prevent any abuse that was, strict, basically to prohibit any abuse that common traders were inflicting on the Native Americans. It was a way in their mind of regulating that, so the government would have control over these trade posts that were known as fur factories. And so they seen it as a safer way for natives to interact with trade, but also making sure that the money and really anything that was traded was going to the federal government rather than citizens of a specific state. So there you go again, kind of taking away the power from the states and making sure it's all centralized under the federal government. So the Office of Indian Trade, actually, like I said, it was opened in 1806 and it lasted until about 1822 when Congress abolished the United States factory system, fur factory system. This decision symbolized the United States movement away from commercialized trade and toward an administrative approach to directly enforce federal authority over trade and interactions with Native Americans. So the abolition of the Office of Indian Trade led President James Monroe, James Monroe's Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, to establish the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1824. Calhoun appointed his friend Thomas Loraine McKenney as superintendent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs due to McKenney's prior experience as a superintendent of the Office of Indian Trade and his unwavering commitment to the policy of civilizing Native Americans through education and relocation to Western territories, an approach that aligned with the goals of the current administration. So I've talked about him, but who is Thomas McKenney and why is he significant in today's lecture? So now I'll move into the story of Thomas McKenney and the history of the Indian tribes of North America. So Thomas Loraine McKenney was born on March 21st, 1785 in Somerset County, Maryland, to a prominent family. At the age of 27, McKenney, he was full of political ambition, enlisted into the United States Army during the War of 1812, where he served as the Army's chief supply officer. After the war concluded, McKenney operated a dry goods business with his brother-in-law, while at the same time kind of seeking a position within the federal government. So when John Mason resigned as the superintendent of the Office of Indian Trade in 1816, McKenney actually petitioned President James Monroe for the job, in which the president appointed McKenney to the position on April 12, 1816. So in this position, McKenney's, really his paramount interest, if you will, or his main goal was Indian reform at the time. So he initiated programs and shaped policy to what he conceived as the government's primary obligation to civilize and Christianize the indigenous people. Although he viewed Native Americans through a paternalistic lens, as he believed the power of the federal government should be used for the public good by allowing the white man to serve as missionaries to save the souls, and then, mind you, this is a quote, to save the souls that otherwise may perish, end quote. So he believed that the government played this role to establish education and connection to religion among the indigenous people as a way of saving them, or really you can think of it as like an early assimilation approach into American society. McKenney and his fellow humanitarians believed that salvation of the tribes could be best achieved through agriculture and farming. And it was kind of under this understanding that farming would give the Native Americans an appreciation for private property, incentives for personal industry, and the stability they needed for organized society and self-government. So in addition to providing the natives with a civilized education through agriculture, in 1819, McKenney rallied the federal government to establish frontier boarding schools equipped to educate Native Americans, both adults and children, on the, quote, excellent principles of our government, the ties which unite and bind society together, with the great advantages of that state over that of the savage, or impress them with the importance of the observance of those great moral lessons, end quote. So interestingly enough, according to Herman J. Viola, who was a curator emeritus at the Smithsonian National Museum of natural history. McKenney exercised humanitarianism not only based on morality or perceived morality, but also out of self-interest to really prove himself in this position to receive an increased salary that he really expected upon taking the position. However, McKenney's desire for an increased wage became a mirage as the termination of the fur factory system, which is something that McKenney did oversee in this position, led to tremendous financial loss for the United States. So in 1822, the United States Congress terminated the Office of Indian Trade following the decline of the factory system, as the office had been established solely to oversee the government's trading system. 2 years later, in 1824, John C. Calhoun, Secretary of War under John Quincy Adams, established the Bureau of Indian Affairs without legislative sanction and appointed McKenney as Superintendent of Indian Affairs under the new department. Unlike the Office of Indian Trade, the Bureau of Indian Affairs managed the federal government's trade and treaty relations with Native American tribes and executed federal policies toward the indigenous community, all while serving directly within the Department of War. Although McKenney initially advocated for Indian reform, his new position under the Bureau of Indian Affairs ultimately led to an ideological contradiction as he began to advocate for the interests of the United States over those of Native peoples. From 1824 to 1830, McKenney invited representatives of an indigenous nation to Washington, D.C., where the United States government exposed tribal representatives to American civilization with the purpose of intimidating the visitors to sign one-sided treaties of land acquisition. The Bureau of Indian Affairs coerced tribal representatives by providing delegations with clothing, military uniforms, traveling chests, and most importantly, peace medals and American flags. And so at least on this lithograph here, you can see this indigenous person wearing one of those presidential peace medals. This one, I believe, has James Monroe actually on that one there. So additionally, government officials not only led tribal representatives to Washington, D.C., but also New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. During their visits, the Native Americans, they visited theaters, circuses, churches, farms. They inspected battleships, navy yards, and forts. The tour not only showed the Native leaders what assimilation could offer, but the power of the United States had, but really ultimately the power that the United States had to forcibly occupy indigenous land. Although McKenney advocated for the removal of Native Americans by the time he served in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, he understood the importance of preserving artifacts of the indigenous people, whom he believed were destined for extinction, either physically or culturally through assimilation. This fear led McKenney to establish the Indian Office Museum located in the Bureau of Indian Affairs office in the War Department building. This collection held physical collections that McKenney had collected during his years of service in the Office of Indian Trade and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The most important collection was captured on canvas by Charles Bird King, an American portrait artist who painted portraits of tribal representatives who attended treaty negotiations in Washington, D.C. McKenney's collaboration with King was exclusive and did not allow, McKenney did not allow other artists to copy the paintings for publication. I mean, after all, McKenney intended to reprint and publish all 120 portraits himself. As the Indian Office Museum gained public attention, McKenney's vision came to life as he decided to bring the gallery to the public by commissioning Samuel Bradford, a Philadelphia printer, to print reproductions of King's paintings. So although Bradford took on the project, he quickly turned the printing over to Henry Inman and Cephas G. Childs, who established the Inman and Childs lithography firm in Philadelphia. So I've mentioned lithography, but what even is lithography, right? It's a new thing at the time, a new industry. So during a lithography process, Inman and Childs reproduced the portraits by drawing the image on with a greasy crayon on a specially prepared stone. Next, after the stone was dampened, the ink would only, or the ink adhered to only the drawing, providing really hundreds of crisp, clear prints at a quicker rate than traditional printing process. McKenney saw the first proofs of the Native American lithographs in 1830 and was amazed at their accuracy and quality. I mean, after all the partners reviewed the proofs, they felt confident enough to publicly announce their plans to publish a portfolio of all 120 lithographs, accompanied by biographical sketches for public release through a subscription model. So people would subscribe to the publication as a way of funding it. And this was a typical way of funding publications during this time. Those interested in purchasing the early folio could require individual prints for $6 each, or a complete set for $120. In 1830, shortly after the project was launched, President Andrew Jackson dismissed McKenney from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, causing him to lose possession of the Indian Gallery that he was creating this whole time, or the Indian Office Museum. So really, McKenney kind of, I guess, saved this project by getting an early start on the printing process, obviously as he did not foresee the Bureau of Indian Affairs office getting terminated under Jackson. So although McKenney lost his position, he possessed all 120 lithographs and also the countless connections to continue producing his publications in the years to come. Although McKenney produced an introduction to his portfolio that he wrote himself, he needed a talented biographer to recall the lives of the indigenous delegations who visited Washington, D.C. So in 1835, McKenney, who really only knew the indigenous peoples by their names, hired a man named James Hall, who was a Western historian and journal editor, to write the biographical sketches of those pictured in the lithographs. Although Hall was a skilled writer, believe it or not, he did not consult the indigenous people when collecting the stories for his biographical sketches. Instead, Hall gathered this information on these indigenous people through interviews with Indian agents, traders, and soldiers, rather than consulting with the native people directly. In 1836, McKenney soft-released an introductory portfolio titled Catalog of 115 Indian Portraits, essentially just to arouse the public and get it in their minds that there would be a forthcoming 3-volume portfolio titled The History of the Indian Tribes of North America. 1 year later, in 1837, McKenney and Hall published their first volume of History of Indian Tribes of North America and circulated the publication in the general public with the help of Edward C. Biddle, a Philadelphia print and book publisher. However, although McKenney and Hall successfully launched their publication, the Panic of 1837 sent the project into a financial crisis as subscribers, ended up withdrawing their support in an effort to preserve their own wealth. So the Panic of 1837 not only placed the subscribers in financial distress, but also delayed publication and created complications in production. So really it wasn't until 1841 when most of these publishers regained financial stability that they rallied together and put together another volume of the History of Indian Tribes in North America. So the second volume came out in 1841. And then again, these publishers, and by publishers I should say Edward C. Biddle, Frederick W. Grinnell, James T. Bowen, and Daniel Rice, and James G. Clark. These are all the publishers who kind of helped make this thing possible. So they all consulted with James Hall in order to get the biographies for the next publication. 3 years later, in 1844, the final volume of the History of the Indian Tribes of North America was released to the public, marking an end to a 14-year effort to preserve the memory of indigenous people whom the federal government had coerced into signing these one-sided treaties, created to essentially assert authority over desired territories on ancestral land. While the history of the Indian tribes of North America was a technological success, and what I mean by technological success is really the 3-volume set came about at a crucial time for technology, with lithography becoming a thing, really. And with that being said, J.T. Bowen ended up becoming literally one of the country's finest lithographers, and proved that American lithography could rival European products. And so like really, it helped out the lithographers in this case, but what about the authors, right? I mean, you didn't ever hear me mention anything about Thomas McKenney after the Panic of 1837, and really that's because he became strayed away from the project due to the financial burden the Panic of 1837 put on him. So really, McKenney and Hall received little profit and recognition for the large and expensive project. After dedicating his entire life to studying native populations and advocating for reform and removal of the indigenous populations, McKenney died penniless in 1859, with his legacy literally only preserved in the volumes that had driven him to financial ruin. And so that's kind of an interesting story there, the ebb and flow of Thomas McKenney. But let's talk about the prints and the paintings that Charles Byrd King made and what all happened with them, or really in general, the objects that Thomas McKenney had collected ever since his service in the Office of Indian Trade. So in the 1860s, all of these items actually got moved over into the Smithsonian. And there was an Indian gallery that was essentially established there, where indigenous, clothing and these, lithographs and the paintings and all things indigenous life were kind of showcased and preserved. In 1865, unfortunately, a fire actually wrecked the Smithsonian Institute and destroyed most of that collection, which is very unfortunate. And you might think, okay, well, if most of the collection was destroyed, then it's interesting that I'm sitting here with all of these lithographs here in front of me, and you might wonder, how the heck did the Montgomery County Historical Society get these lithographs? Well, interestingly enough, and as I mentioned, as to why we do this lecture series, there's obviously a local connection to some degree. And the local connection comes from Major Isaac Compton Elston, the father of Henry S. Lane's wife, Joanna Elston Lane, I should say. So Major Isaac Compton Elston likely purchased these lithographs that you see here. So the two that are framed and the three I have in front of me, he likely purchased them for about $6 as individual lithographs, or numbers as they would call them. So he would have purchased those for about $6 around the 1830s. According to our records, Isaac Compton Elston actually knew some of the people that are pictured in the lithographs in front of me. Now, when doing my research, I tried to figure out who might Isaac Elston have known during this time, and it's really hard to say because there's nothing that's ever said, or really what tribes that he was working with on business dealings. But if I was to take a guess, I would say he knew the person pictured here, Tenskwatawa. This is known as the Prophet, and Tecumseh's brother. So Isaac Elston had business dealings in Lafayette, Indiana, just about 40 or so minutes north of Crawfordsville. He actually platted a majority of the city. So I'm assuming that around this time he might have had, or early 1820s, or maybe even prior, he might have had some connection with Tenskwatawa. That is just kind of a guess on my part. The other leader here that he might have ran into or had some dealings with is Wigchai, who is a Saukee chief. And even in the history of the Indian tribes of North America, though, as mentioned, James Hall did not speak with any of these tribal leaders, it does mention that the Saukees, obviously were in Illinois, and may have actually been in the region of the Kankakee region that Isaac Elston was having business dealings in. So it's very possible that these are at least two people I know of, at least I don't know, but at least off the top of my head might have had some business dealings with Isaac Elston. So that's kind of interesting. It's also said that Elston frequently traded with Native Americans in Croppersville in his dry goods store, and also did so on all of his business dealings. I mean, he was a land speculator. He would go off and purchase, lots of land, or areas of land, plat them and sell the lots. Here's where another unique kind of connection with Isaac Elston comes into play, because, as I mentioned, he had a little bit to do with platting Lafayette, but he was the person who platted Michigan City in northern Indiana. With that being said, that was indigenous land at the time, and really after those indigenous tribes had signed the treaties off, Isaac Elston went up to Michigan City, purchased the land, platted the city, sold off lots, and became one of the richest men in Indiana. So in an interesting way, Isaac Elston kind of has a little bit of something to do with the histories and the context that we had talked about today. Hopefully through more research, we'll figure out a little bit more of the specifics and what Isaac Elston was directly involved with during this time. So with that being said, why does all of this matter? Why am I here today telling you about the history of the Indian tribes in North America, Thomas McKenney and James Hall, and all of these connections? And it really is because the history of the Indian tribes in North America stands as a deeply complicated but yet invaluable artifact to American history. It's one that conceals a story of cultural devastation behind lithographs that depict the faces of individuals whose lives were shaped and often shattered by federal authority. At face value, the lithographs project a man or several men's attempt to preserve the identities and likeness of indigenous leaders during a time when their communities were being systematically displaced, silenced, and forgotten. On the other hand, it also is a product of its era, created by a man who helped enforce federal authority over indigenous people to destroy their culture and acquire indigenous land. So this publication reminds us that history isn't neutral. Every portrait, biographical sketch in this collection, it carries a weight of the era's moral contradictions between preservation and erasure, between humanitarian ideals and imperial policies. What makes these lithographs even more powerful is their connection to our own community through Major Isaac Elston's collection and involvement in land speculation. So we see how national policies of removal and assimilation were not abstract events. They played out in real places with real consequences and had to do with folks who were from the county. So these lithographs don't just tell a story of distant policy decisions, they tether us to them. They ask us to reflect not only on the past, but on the legacy it has left in our own backyards. So as we preserve and display these lithographs today, let us also preserve the deeper, more difficult truths they represent. Let them serve as a reminder of the human cost of American expansion, and as a call to engage more honestly with the full scope of our shared history. Thank you all again for attending today's lecture, whether in person or virtually. I hope you enjoyed. This has been a really fascinating topic to research. Look forward to producing more for you guys in the future. So thanks again for watching another episode in the Montgomery County Historical Society's Lessons in History lecture series. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or even corrections, feel free to reach out to us on the Montgomery County Historical Society website, and I'd love to get back with you. In the meantime, stay tuned for more history videos.